Don't do that.
Okay, I don't know how to start. I'm feeling a bit nervous. So, as you may or may not know, Book Talk, BookTube, and other book communities have something of a problem, and that problem is hyperconsumption. I saw a video about it, and I can't remember what it was or what if I actually watched it. It might have just been the title. The problem with book content creators is that we, I have just started, they often do book hauls and they get little, these bookshelves, all these like fancy things for book content. I mean, we've seen thumbnails of people literally holding a huge stack of books and they're like, this is my book haul for like this week. And it's just so many books that they will actually never read and whatever, they just got them because they look pretty. That's a problem. It's 2024. We're in a recession. And quite frankly, books cannot sit on your bookshelf just to look pretty. And I say that as a culprit, an active participant in that culture. This year, in 2024, starting January 1st, woo, new year, Illinois has just banned book bans in the whole state, meaning that public libraries cannot remove books and or ban books in, well, actually I don't know I don't know the exact language of that bill that they put into law, but essentially, as we know, there is a lot of censorship that goes on in libraries and schools and anything where books exist, where governments will try to control the kind of books that we are able to consume. The book thief is right here. There's like books that whatever were historically banned, but we have so many books that like have recently come out that they're currently banned in a lot of like musty areas of the US, but whatever. Not necessarily anyone's fault other than the government. And the reason why there's so many book bans and the kind of books that they're targeting is because we as a society we recognize that a lot of these books hold so much power in that they teach us so much without necessarily having to be like a textbook or a dictionary or an explicit learning resource. We learn through story. So these books, any books, if you just have them sitting on your bookshelf, they do nothing. They're just an aesthetic. They just look pretty and they give the illusion that you have read them. So I did a count prior to the new year, and I have in my collection, roughly, because I missed some, I have at least 110 books on this bookshelf. That is a lot of books. And I have read less than half. There are so many books on this bookshelf behind me that I have not actually read. And whether or not I had any actual intention, of course I had an intention to read the books. I didn't buy them necessarily just so they could look pretty, except maybe one, but I will get to that. There's so many books that I bought with the intention of actually reading them, only to unfortunately have them gather dust on my bookshelf. So that was something that when I started the new year, I was like, I'm not going to do that. I was like, you know, I have so many books and so many good books. Like, I went back and I made a spreadsheet of every book, including the title, the author, how many pages, and just so I can keep track, like my own personal Goodreads. And going through all the titles and the summaries, I was like, I remember why I wanted to read this book. But unfortunately, I never made time to. There was just too many books that I wanted to read. I never knew where to start. So I just didn't. This year, I also wanted to start my booktube career because I love books and I want to be a part of the community and I want to have friends that also like books. So I thought, why not get two birds with one stone? So, my project for this year is to read every single book on my TBR list without purchasing a new one until I'm completely finished with every single book that I have bought and every single book that's sitting behind me. But I also have another major dilemma because I didn't necessarily feel comfortable creating content that diverts attention away from current issues. So, I thought, this is my little trademarked phrase, is that my thoughts into going into this project: conscious content curation, meaning that the books that I'm going to cover, a lot of them tackle social issues because the reality is that as writers, I say not having a published book, but Writers, people that create books and media, are oftentimes people that are recording history without knowing it. So it's so important that we examine these books, especially books that talk about issues such as race, gender, identity, things of that nature. It's very important to have these spaces and to have these conversations. We're being conscious, and a lot of these books are relevant to what's going on today. So, I'm sorry, I'm mocosa. So, I thought, okay, I have so many goals, so many aspirations. I want to be a booktuber. I want to read all the books on my TBR list. And I still want to do so and create content in a conscious way that doesn't divert attention away from social issues that are going on in our society today. So I thought, what better book to start with than the one I'm going to talk about right now? So this book I purchased from Barnes& and Noble during Banned Books Week, and I was like, whoa, why is this a banned book? But now I get it. So they call this Enemy by George Takei. This is a graphic novel. It's a New York Times bestseller, and the art is beautiful. It'll take a minute. Beautiful. So George Takei, if you do not know, he is an actor best known for his role on Star Trek. I don't know the name of his character. He says it in here. It is Lieutenant Hikaru Sulu. Sulu. He is in Star Trek. That is his like iconic role. That's who he is. But he is also an activist because, largely in part of his history, when he was a child, he was sent to a Japanese internment camp during the 1940s. So, December 7th, 1941. My hair is messed up. Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor, which was a military base in Hawaii. So the US, very vaguely, again, I'm not a historian, was dragged into World War II. But because this attack happened on US soil, again, US soil, quote unquote, there was mass hysteria amongst the public, and specifically a lot of racism and xenophobia against Japanese American citizens. And they decided sometime after that, they essentially passed, it was Executive Order 9066. I've already read another book since this one, and I'm in the middle of another one. So remembering all the dates is kind of hard. So the president, Mr. Roosevelt, signed an executive order that essentially allowed him to name specific areas of the US as military zones. And in those military zones, he is allowed to expel any specific people from that military zone as he sees fit, which was a very vague and broad way of saying that they could deem parts of the US, specifically East Coast, no, West.
Oh my God. Oh.
Did you hear me mess up the directions? Okay, recovering from that embarrassment. On the West Coast, not the East Coast, not to be confused, very similar, very different. Roosevelt essentially gave himself the power to expel Japanese Americans from a large part of the West Coast, very targeted against the West Coast because it had a very high Japanese American population. I'm not a historian. I did some research, I listened to a lot of videos in preparation and as I was reading because my interest was piqued. A not so funny story. I did not learn about Japanese internment in the US until my junior year of high school. So I was 16, 17 when I learned about it. It's not necessarily my fault. I was a child, a product of my education at the time, but I was not taught about Japanese internment until my junior year. And even then, it was a very small portion of the textbook. It was not something that they went into in a lot of detail. When I learned about it, I was stunned. I was like, whoa, what? They brushed on it very briefly in my education. I learned a little bit more through my college years, and again, in preparation for this video, I learned a lot more. So leading up to Executive Order 9066, there was a lot of racism and xenophobia in the US, specifically, again, on the West Coast. So on the government side, they first started with curfews against Japanese Americans, which I forget the exact hours, but they weren't allowed out, like specifically after dark. I'm gonna say just as like a broad, other people in the neighborhoods, business owners would not do business with Japanese Americans. They would not hire them for jobs. Yes, a lot of racism, xenophobia against these people. The government also started rounding up social leaders amongst the Japanese American community. So that was, think like, religious leaders, public figures. They would arrest them and question them about their supposed involvement with the Japanese government and whether or not they were involved in espionage. All that eventually leads to Executive Order 9066, which gives the government the power to expel Japanese American citizens to these concentration camps where they're held against their Fifth Amendment? No, 14th. The Due Process Amendment. These citizens are held without cause, without any formal charges brought against them, solely because they are of Japanese descent. So eventually, as this executive order starts rolling out, they essentially will post in certain areas and towns, okay, this executive order is going into effect. You need to prepare. So Japanese Americans were forced out of their homes. They had to sell a lot of their belongings. They were not allowed to bring almost anything with them as they were taken to these camps. They could only take oftentimes like whatever they could carry. So they had to sell a lot of their stuff, and people would not pay a fair price for their items. This story starts off with George Takei. He's a young boy. Executive Order 9066 has just rolled out in his area of Los Angeles. So in the story, George Takei is a young boy and he has two younger siblings, a younger brother and a baby sister, and his two parents who are of Japanese descent. His father was born in Japan. His mother was born here, but she spent a lot of time in Japan, whereas he was fluent in both languages. He spent a majority of his time in the US, and they were in a dry cleaning business. They were a very happy, healthy family. They had good structure. They had a home. Their life was the perfect American dream. They are taken by the US government to an internment camp where, at first, because they were not prepared to take these citizens, because the majority of the people that they were taking of Japanese descent were US citizens. These aren't just people that immigrated to the US, whether again legally or illegally. They're US citizens. A lot of them have not been to Japan, were not born there, don't speak Japanese. Can you imagine if that happened where the government was like, okay, anyone that is like white, blonde hair, blue eyes, we're rounding you up because you are no longer a US citizen. Like that would be so crazy. We'd be like, what do you mean? That's like the image of an American citizen. How can you say that they're not American? But that's what they did to these Japanese American citizens just because they were descended from Japan. Whatever. In this story, when his family is first taken to an internment camp, they are actually taken to stables, horse stables that have been repurposed for the purpose of internment. They have cots in these stables. Again, I'm going to reiterate, where horses were, they did not clean them out. They still had poop and hay and all this, animal stuff in the stalls. People were forced to reside in very, very dangerous conditions. So many people got sick, including, he said, his younger sister got very sick living in those conditions because it was just not clean. It was inhumane. These people were often crammed next to each other. They could not hold all the people that they wrongfully imprisoned. But whatever, that was temporary living quarters. Eventually, they ended up building official, proper internment camps further in the Midwest. They would transport, again, American citizens on train to go to these internment camps. They were not allowed to draw the windows. People were not allowed to see them because, again, despite a lot of xenophobia and racism going on in the US at this time, they still thought, oh, maybe people would feel some kind of way if we're shipping trains full of American citizens being held against their will across state lines to be imprisoned. Maybe that's a bad look. I'm not laughing because it's funny. I'm laughing out of pure disbelief because, 1940 was not even 100 years ago. This happened so recently in US history, and the fact that, and again, my education is not a reflection of everyone's education, but the fact that I didn't even learn about it until so late in my I'm gobsmacked. They're eventually shipped to an internment camp. I forget which middle of nowhere state it is. Hold on. I found it. So they were sent to, I'm probably not going to pronounce this correctly, but I don't care to because it was a prison. It's Rower Relocation Center, aka Camp Rower, in the easternmost of the 10 internment states, this one specifically being along the Mississippi River in Arkansas. I am very bad directionally. Yes, Arkansas, the land of opportunity. They are taken to Arkansas on train with many, many other US citizens and internees. So this is something of an upgrade from the horse stalls that they were forced to reside in. It was like not like, oh, a few days, a few weeks. It was months. Months that they spent in those stalls. They are then transported to Arkansas Camp Rower, where they have makeshift cabins that are built, again, very hastily by the US government. They are very poorly air conditioned. They don't have air conditioning. Let me backtrack. It's very stifling. They are cramped with other people. It is only one room. And it's really sweet because in the moment that they arrive, George Takei says that his mom, while they're on the trip, again, because this is through his perspective as a child. So he doesn't necessarily understand what is going on. Again, a child. So he's looking back at these memories with a bittersweetness of childhood. And I think that, obviously not everyone can empathize or even imagine the kind of things that he had to go through. But I think we can all kind of resonate with that mentality of when you experience things as a kid that aren't good, very traumatic, how it didn't feel that way when you were a kid because of whatever way that you looked at it when you were a kid. Your brain was just too young to really process what it is that you were going through. So in this moment, he's recalling the train ride and that his mom went through very great efforts to make sure that him and his siblings were entertained. They had candy. They thought like they were on a trip, they were on vacation. And he juxtaposes that with his current mentality. Obviously, he knows better now, saying that like now as an adult, he thinks about how stressed she must have been and how painful and hard it must have been to have to essentially put on a show for your children so that they won't be scared. And it's very heartbreaking. But when they get to Camp Rower and they find their little cabin, their unit, they go in because his mom said that she had saved a very special treat until when they arrived. So they get to the cabin and she opens her bag. It's something very heavy. And she pulls out a sewing machine. It's not allowed. She's not supposed to have that. And she pulls out a sewing machine, and their father's like, you're going to get in so much trouble. Why did you bring that? Why would you bring a sewing machine of all things when we had to leave? And she was like, the kids are going to grow out of their clothes. They'll need new ones eventually. We can use this. And it's a moment between his parents where they're laughing. And he as a kid was very disappointed. He was expecting something like, I don't know, candy or something that like a child would enjoy. A child doesn't enjoy a sewing machine. It's like a moment where again, he's a kid. He doesn't understand what's going on. Where as adults, like they're laughing because it's just like something so unreasonable in the sense of like of all the things to bring with you. She brought a sewing machine. So it like dissolves the tension. But again, for him as a kid, he's like, like you brought a sewing machine? I equate it to that moment in Mockingjay when Prim brings Buttercup the cat when they're all trying to like get in the bunker and Katniss is like, you brought the cat? And she's like, I couldn't leave him. And it's like, that's so ridiculous. But they're like, yeah. Like, it's just like a very human moment. So the story follows them as they're at Camp Rower. Just like the life that they have to essentially like live while they're there. They're trying to have some sense of normalcy. Their father ends up garnering a lot of respect from their neighbors and other people that are in their little block. He becomes the block manager. He advocates for the people to the military guards on their behalf to get, like certain arrangements. He even has a secretary. Like it really feels like their own little micro society within, again, an internment camp. So as they're talking about their time at Camp Rower, George Takei also brings up two specific U.S. court cases, U.S. Supreme Court cases. So it was specifically important. The Korematsu decision. So the Korematsu decision. Again, I'm not a historian. This man, Japanese American citizen, refused to go to the internment camp, and in his refusal, he was, of course, taken into custody by the police. He sued on the basis that it violated their right to due process, which due process is essentially that you have the right to a fair trial. It'll be a speedy, fair trial. You get your lawyer, you have the right to a jury, all that good stuff. Essentially, that the government, the US, cannot just arrest you without going through the proper steps to take you into custody, prove you're guilty, or I'm sorry, take you into custody, allow you to defend yourself, and then, whether prove you're guilty or not guilty. In this court case, he was essentially arguing that they were denying Japanese American citizens this right by simply taking them as prisoners. And the Supreme Court ruled in a 6-3, like 6-4, this decision, that it was constitutional because they were in times of war and there was a greater risk of espionage and that they couldn't afford those rights to Japanese American citizens because it was times of war. Crazy. Literally crazy. So he briefly brings these up because again, they're getting news while they're in these internment camps. They have access to newspapers, which is great. And so they're learning about, these decisions, people that are trying to help them and trying to fight and advocate for their rights. And essentially, I'm going to jump a little bit toward the end, but the Korematsu decision was recently, let me grab you by the throat when I say this, recently overturned by the US Supreme Court in the same decision that allowed the president at the time, then president, disgraced President Donald Trump, to uphold the ban of Muslims to the US. Is that not ironic? Are we not is what's not clicking? So, this decision was overturned, I think either 2018 or 2019. The Korematsu decision, not the decision to ban a group of people from immigrating to the US. And the US Supreme Court was essentially like, that was really bad, I'm so sorry, but we're also going to do the same thing to this other group of people. That's okay, but this wasn't. Sorry. So he brings this up again. I spoiled the ending a little bit, but whatever. While, these Supreme Court cases are going on, they are not allowing, no. This is what I get for not taking notes. I just didn't want to write in the book. I know, I'm such a loser. Their time at Camp Rower is very, like, the way it's portrayed in the story is really interesting because it gives you like such a glimpse on to how they again go through their time there, how they cope with it, and how they try to make it seem like a sense of normalcy. He reflects on these memories that he has and like with just like such a childish glimmer to it. It's so sad to think about in like the context of these memories that he has from childhood where it's like you can't even remember like things that are supposed to be funny or like just generally very lighthearted because in the context that they happen, it's just so sad. He remembers that an older boy in the camp had told him, if you go up to the military, like the guards, and tell them everything you want, and then you say Sakana Beach, then they will give you whatever you want. And so little baby George Takei goes up to these military guards. The boys tell him like, oh, you have to say it fast because when you say it fast, it sounds like a cuss word. Why am I pretending I don't cuss? It sounds like son of a bitch. The military guards end up chasing him away, and he asks his dad, like, why didn't they give me what I wanted? And he also talks about like his dad was such a source of like information and trust between him and his siblings where it was like dad knows everything. And I think that that's something that a lot of children can empathize with, like when we're kids, our only source of like information and experiences is from our parents. So a lot of times it's like, yeah, they know everything. And especially like his dad was the block manager, they had like whatever status in that time. He goes through all these memories that he has, which again are there's such a sense of like bittersweetness as he's talking about them because they're supposed to be like in any other circumstance. If you take out the place and if he told you that story and was like, oh, I was at home, I was in my backyard, or I was like in the streets of LA, it would be like such a wonderful, cute memory. But because it's in the context of these internment camps, it's like you can't even really think of it as a happy memory because it's like stained by the circumstances that they were created. So eventually, one of the big moments in the story is the US government essentially puts out a survey to all the people that are in these internment camps, essentially asking them questions about their loyalty to the US. And there's two specific questions that were very controversial. Let me find them because I want to word them correctly. So the questions is two specific questions, questions 27 and 28 on the survey. Question number 27 is, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? Okay. Question 28, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attack by foreign or domestic forces and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor, to any foreign government, power, or organization? And so these questions are important because, and he words it so, so well. And I'm going to read it straight from the book. Question 27 wanted us to pledge our lives for a country that had upended our families and put us behind barbed wire fences. Question 28 rested on a false premise that we all had a racial allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. To answer yes would be to agree that we all had such loyalty to give up. Yes or no, either response would be used to justify our wrongful imprisonment, as if they'd been right to call us enemy aliens and lock us up in the first place. Okay, and so again, beautiful artwork. So his parents answered no to both of these questions. In this section, he explains why. Like all Asian immigrants, he was forbidden from applying for U.S. citizenship. Question 27 asked him to serve in combat for a country that had rejected and then imprisoned him because of his ethnicity. He was 40 years old with a wife and 3 young children. Question 28 asked him to discard his entire Japanese heritage, relatives, memories, and the place of his birth for a country that would not have him. Answering yes would make him stateless. For my mother, question 27 was absurd, but question 28 caused her great frustration. She was an American-born citizen, and all her children were Americans. She was married to a man her country rejected, and now called an enemy alien. Her country took everything her family had, put them behind fences in the hot Arkansas swamp. Now she was expected to put that family second to a nation that had rejected them. These specific questions caused a lot. They became infamous because they essentially pointed out very blatantly to a lot of people that the US government, the true audacity of the US government to imprison these people, dehumanize them, truly dehumanize them, and then ask them to pledge loyalty to a country that would not even recognize them as US citizens. Like, imagine that. And not only not recognize them as citizens, but then ask them to fight on behalf of the country that rejected them and imprisoned them. It's awful. It's truly awful. It's even more awful when you realize that a lot of these people that were answering these questions answered yes because they wanted desperately to prove their patriotism so that they would not be seen as enemy aliens anymore. They wanted to prove that they were willing to do all these things just so that the US would recognize them. And as a result, so many Japanese Americans enlisted in the war, died in the war, died fighting in this war against other Japanese soldiers, fighting for a country that would not have them. George Takei in the book mentions that there was a mission that they sent a specific all Japanese American troop to go essentially rescue this other, I don't know military terms. They sent this all American battalion to go to the front lines and rescue this troop that was under heavy enemy fire. And they were able to reclaim that front line and save the troops. Wonderful. Amazing. They received, medals of honor and I don't want to spoil it, but it's just the government gave them like medals of recognition, but they were not as praised as they should have been for all the work that these Japanese soldiers did. Now comes like I don't want to say climax, but so in response, because his parents had answered no to question 27 and 28, they were transferred to a second camp. And this camp was specific to people that they deemed as like threats or like disloyalists to the American government. So on May 14th, 1944, George Takei and his family was transferred to Camp Tool Lake. It was very different from their previous camp because he says there's not one layer of barbed wire fence, but three. The government had converted it into a maximum security segregation camp for disloyals, guarded by battle-ready troops, machine gun towers, and even tanks. Oh, and this, oh my God, this is my favorite panel. So I'm gonna read the text first and then I'm gonna show you the panel. So essentially it's him and his younger brother, and his younger brother asks like, "Oh, why did we move here?" They explain, well, George Takei explains to his brother that his parents are no-nos, which is what they call people that replied no and no to question 27 and 28. Like our parents, many others have responded no, no on the loyalty questionnaire. A minority of people applied for re- repatriation. A minority of people apply for repatriation, but few wanted to be sent to a war-torn Japan. So we ended up here, all imprisoned, driven to outrage by a government's hysteria. Tool Lake was the most notorious, the most cruel, and by far the largest of the 10 camps. At its peak, this heavily militarized facility held 18,000 internees. Nearly half of them were kids like us. Now, I am going to show you the panel because the reason why some people choose graphic novels when choosing to write a story is because graphic novels, oftentimes, in of course being visually appealing, they also have visual storytelling on top of having words. And the visual storytelling from this panel truly, like, I put down the book because it was just so like, oh my God, let me show you. So if you can see, this is the panel that talks about it, and it splits between the adults, and then it has like a very visible break, and then you see the pictures of the children underneath, which in my interpretation is like, unfortunately, because of the decisions and the responses that these adults had to this questionnaire, it unfortunately impacted their children. His parents had a very moral reason for replying no and no to this questionnaire. No one and no one can penalize or be upset with anyone that answered the questionnaire in that way. But because they did, and because many others did, it impacted their children and unfortunately subjected them to Camp Tool Lake, which I think is how you pronounce that. But again, I don't care to pronounce it correctly. So while they're in this camp, again, they replied no and no to this questionnaire for moral reasons. It wasn't necessarily that they were trying to make a statement or protest or do anything necessary. It's very like civil disobedience what they were doing by replying in that way. But there were a lot of people in that camp that were very vocal against the US government, truly like activists, if you will. And unfortunately, because they were seen as disloyals, they were very heavily guarded, subjected to a lot of cruel and unfair treatment. There were a lot of riots he talks about, very bad situations. His mother complains because, again, they are in a new place that's very different from the last camp. And again, both camps are still wrongful imprisonment camps for Japanese American citizens. But in the last one, they had like some sense of normalcy. Whereas in this camp, everything's different. Their living quarters is not the same. They're farther away from the bathrooms. They're closer to the kitchen. Their mother constantly complains about their living situation. There's a scene where George has to take his younger brother to the bathroom, but it's so far away that they didn't make it, and he ends up peeing himself. It's very sad. Immediately, you get a sense of like, we're not in the same place anymore. This is truly imprisonment. So as he's reflecting on his memories from this specific time, now is also when he starts embedding conversations that he had with his father as a young man and asking him more like probing questions about their time in the internment camps, because again, when he's a young adult, it's still very fresh. They had only just been freed from these camps and allowed back into society. So he has a lot of questions, and it's not like it's in history books. It's not like people are necessarily talking about it. So his only source of information is, again, his father. But now, instead of taking what he says at face value, he has more questions and specifically more arguments. Where, again, he's a young adult, he doesn't necessarily understand. And his father is very willing to have these conversations with him and be open as possible. He just feels a lot of resentment for what they had to endure as children, and he feels like, I would never do this. If it was me in your position and I had children, I would never allow them to take me. You knew it was wrong, why didn't you do this? And it's just like unfair criticism to direct to his father, because again, his father didn't create those camps. Unfortunately, like, he truly had no other choice. He could have refused to go, but we know from the Korematsu decision, and unfortunately I can't remember the other man's name, other people who had refused to go were severely punished. So in that instance, he felt that he had no other choice. Again, now as he's a young man, he can't really wrap his head around that. And we see from his reflections as a kid, as a young adult, as a man, how his understanding evolves. So while they're in this new camp, another decision from the president rolls out, which is essentially, I forget what the official name is, but the government essentially allows citizens, and they again broaden it to like, oh, whoever wants to, but it's obviously directed to Japanese American citizens, that they can relinquish their US citizenship and, thus leave the camps and go back to Japan. A lot of people were like, maybe I don't want to do that. But the reason that this was like rolled out, it was kind of hard to like understand. Let me go to the page actually. And the reason why I like this book so much is that like he's going through his childhood memories and then adding context with his current mindset and all the information that he has learned since growing up with that experience. Like, he went through that experience, of course, but he didn't understand it until much later in his life. So going back and adding that context and filling in those gaps is essential to coming to terms with like the trauma that you have endured and recognizing these cycles of violence and injustice going through into the future and against other people, which is so important that this book has been created, and it's so important that people read it. But anyway, that will be towards the end. Okay, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. So, while they are imprisoned in these camps, the US is currently at war at this time, currently at war with Japan and the Axis powers. They get word that while they're in the camps, the US has attacked specifically Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'm sorry, I'm a little scattered just because it's very chaotic. 7 days after the attack, Japan admits defeat and the war is over. They get this news, and at first, a lot of the people in these camps don't believe it. They think that this is not true, that they're being fed lies. They are very slow to really think about it because they're like, imagine you've never heard of an atomic bomb, and all of a sudden you find out that you don't even really know the kind of devastation the US has inflicted upon. And again, he goes over this in the book. His mother has family in these areas. She doesn't know if they're alive. But imagine at that time, you've never heard of such level of destruction that could force a country to essentially like admit defeat within 7 days. Wars go on for years. I can't imagine to have previous experiences with like wars taking years and years and years, and then all of a sudden it's over in a week from one attack. It must have been horrifying not knowing truly what level of devastation the US was able to inflict on Japan. So, the reasoning that he gives is that, okay, again, the US government essentially allows Japanese Americans to relinquish their US citizenship. And the reason that some people decide to do so is because they believe that it will keep them safe. Because if they relinquish their status as US citizens, then they will stay in the camps inside the fence where they believe, again, that it is safe. The US officials were heavily implying, that it was not safe for Japanese American citizens outside of the fence. So people, especially like he says his mom, believed that if they relinquished their US citizenship, that it would keep their family together and keep them in the camps, which again, at that time is their only way of life and what they feel is their only guarantee for safety. The war is coming to an end at this time. So they believe that if enough people relinquish their US citizenship, that they'll have to keep the camps open and therefore people will get to stay with their families. But as, the war ends, they're now afraid because after Japan admits defeat, the war is declared over. The officials start closing the camps and encouraging Japanese American citizens to leave. But so many of them have, at this point, relinquished their US citizenship. So the US is now getting ships ready to take these people that have relinquished their citizenship back to Japan. So a new crisis is on the horizon because now, yay, they're free. They're out of the camps. They don't have to stay in there anymore. But now, so many people are about to be deported to Japan. Very scary. A lot of crisis. So, very fortunately, his mother and a lot of other Japanese American citizens were able to get legal defense, and they brought the case all the way to the Supreme Court, where essentially they eventually agreed that it's all coming back to me. So they get a court date and they are allowed to mitigate the decision. So his mother is allowed to stay in the United States. And the end of this case is that they essentially argue that people shouldn't be allowed to give up their US citizenship like that, especially in this circumstance because they were coerced into making this decision. The United States is like, okay, fine, you can keep your US citizenship. We won't accept any resignations. So those are all void. His mother is allowed to keep her citizenship status. Everything is great. But now the new problem on the horizon is they have spent the last 2-ish years in these internment camps. They no longer have a home to go back to. A lot of their homes have now been occupied. Hold on. Sorry, just a brief little change. A lot of their homes have now been trashed and occupied since they were no longer there, again, because they were wrongfully imprisoned in these internment camps. Their belongings have all been stolen, trashed. They no longer have a place to go back to. So, as George Takei and his family, they've gotten through the crisis of, again, his mother giving up her citizenship. They get it fixed. They're now out of the camps. They have, oh my God, sorry, I'm just remembering so much history right now. So the US government, after they close the internment camps, they give each person, each internee, a ticket to go wherever they want in the country by train. And $20 and say, start your new life. Good luck. First, their father ends up going back to California to kind of like test the waters because now they're afraid the war's over, but I mean, who's to say that they're not still going to face a lot of the racism and xenophobia that they were subjected to before they left for the internment camps. So his dad is like, I'm going to test the waters, see how it is. Maybe we can move somewhere else. So he goes, he's gone for about, I think it's a month or 2 months. And he comes back and he's like, okay, it's safe. We can, start shop. We can start our new lives. And they're like, cool. So they go back to California. And George Takei says that once they're back, their first residence, now that they're free, now that they are no longer interned illegally by the US government, they live on Skid Row, which, if you didn't know, Skid Row is in California and Los Angeles, and it has an extremely high homeless population living along the streets, and they are now living there. So they live in a motel type area with a lot of other former Japanese American internees, and they try to start their life. Their father ends up opening a kind of business to help previous internees, get jobs and kind of get their footing now that they are thrust back into their old lives. He does not accept payment for his services. He does this truly out of the kindness of his own heart, and I could cry thinking about it. I could honestly cry because that's just I couldn't imagine, because he says he literally accepted no payment. It's not that no one wanted to pay him. He did not accept payment. He truly, again, out of the kindness of his heart, helped so many people. So eventually they're able to leave Skid Row and, start their life. And they get back to a sense of normalcy. And the end of the book is George Takei talking about the rest of his life, where he eventually goes to school, he starts acting, he lands minor roles before, again, landing his major role in Star Trek. He dedicates his life to the pursuit of social justice. He's an activist. He does a lot of work helping Japanese American citizens, especially those affected by the illegal internment in the 1940s. So in the 1980s, the president publicly on record says that the internment of the Japanese Americans during World War II was illegal, immoral, and a stain on American history. This was incredibly wrong. We shouldn't have done this, and we take full responsibility. So they decide to pay reparations to the surviving Japanese American citizens that went through the internment. He gives them the equivalent, I believe it's $20,000. Oh my God, I'm just remembering so much. So hopefully I edit this so that it's at the beginning. Most of the Japanese Americans that are sent to the internment camps are on the West Coast. But there was, again, Pearl Harbor was in Hawaii. And there was a notably very high population of Japanese American citizens in Hawaii at that time. But Hawaii, despite being declared a military zone, did not see internment as high as the numbers on the West Coast. And the reason for this was because the US government acknowledged that most of the workforce in Hawaii was made up of these Japanese American citizens. So very, very, very few of these people were forced into internment compared to the Japanese American citizens on the West Coast, just adding to the level of atrocity committed by the US government at this time, 1988. Ronald Reagan admitted the US government illegally imprisoned 120,000 people of Japanese descent in the US. He takes full responsibility for the illegal imprisonment of these people and decides to pay them reparations. Not all 120,000, because not all 120,000 people are still living at this point in time. Again, it is 40 years after the internment of these people. They decide to pay reparations in the amount of $20,000 per living internee. US inflation calculator. In today's money, $20,000 is about almost $52,000. The US government paid reparations. I believe they said at this point, only half of these people are still living. And unfortunately, George Takei's father is not one of these people that will receive the money, because by this time, unfortunately, he had passed away. And it wasn't even until 1991, that's 3 years after reparations have been announced, that George Takei received his check. So George Takei actually went on to donate that money to start the founding of the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. So a common theme throughout this book is that they talk about, specifically, his father is a very large supporter of democracy, specifically the US democracy, and that they are afforded such a privilege to experience this democracy and be able to participate, and that the wheels of democracy turn slowly, but eventually change can happen, is a common theme throughout this book. Again, this story kind of flip-flops in time. So George Takei also talks about how he was invited to the house of the President Roosevelt, who, again, signed Executive Order 9066 into law. And he was invited by, I believe, his descendants, the president's descendants, to speak in his home about Japanese internment. George Takei had some conflicting feelings about being there in the home of the person that had illegally imprisoned him and his family, as well as 120,000 other people. So a lot of the Japanese soldiers that served for the US in the war were awarded medals, but with the efforts of George Takei and other activists, they were able to rally the US government to give them the highest medal of honor, because they originally were, I think the highest medal was like the second highest. So they were eventually given the highest medal of honor for their service in World War II. And they opened investigations into any other person of Japanese descent that received a medal for their service, to make sure that they were not denied the highest medal that they should have gotten, again, because of their Japanese ancestry. So that was in part by a lot of the rallying that George Takei and other activists did on behalf of the Japanese American citizens. And I love the ending of this book because, and I think that's what is truly very inspiring. And again, a reason that I think this book was so important to start off with, because George Takei is talking about these very important issues this trauma that he experienced growing up. He was not guilty of anything other than being of Japanese descent. I wanted to talk about this book because I think George Takei alludes to something greater with talking about his experiences, which is this happened again. It's not even been 100 years since the internment of America's own citizens purely on the basis of race and ethnicity. And unfortunately, it's not an isolated incident. It's not, and what I really think was a big part of like the ending is that it's not something that can happen again if we let it. If we as citizens, as people in society, don't recognize the steps that lead to things like Executive Order 9066 happening, if we don't recognize them in the past, then we can't stop it in the future. Which again, I'll bring up the title of this book is They Called Us Enemy, which is very important because, again, the people that were in these internment camps, a lot of them were US citizens. A lot of these people did not speak Japanese. A lot of these people had no ties to the Japanese Empire at that time. Every single thing that these people were subjected to was based on fear, racism, and xenophobia. Executive Order 9066, the Korematsu decision. Every single thing that these people were subjected to is something that could happen again, and is something that is happening currently. And I think it's also important because he's saying they called us enemy, as in they called children enemies. They called US citizens enemies. They called normal, everyday people enemies of the US government. These are your neighbors, people you know, people you see on the street, people that before 1941 might have even been your friend. The US government allowed this entire world to see them as an enemy because of the actions of a government and not the actions of them as individuals. This might sound very familiar to you, and it should. The day that we allow propaganda and other outlets to call children like George Takei, children like the people you see in this book, to call them enemies for something that they cannot control, where they were born, where they're descended from, is the day that things like this can happen again. And it is happening again. It's so important that we read stories like this and that we as a society do not allow ourselves to forget what led to things like this happening. It's so incredibly important. And it's also so incredibly important that we advocate for these other groups that are being subjected to the same things that these Japanese Americans were being subjected to. I love George Takei. He's amazing because he has recognized that these were the things that happened to him that led to his suffering as a child. And he's recognizing it in other groups, other minority groups, and he's taking a stand against it and talking about it. Because even though, hey, it's not happening to you anymore, hey, it's over now, doesn't mean that you have to stop talking about it and that you can't advocate for other people that are now being subjected to the same injustices. George Takei is a pillar of solidarity. He is an activist and he's amazing. I have so many feelings. Anyway, that was They Called Us Enemy by George Takei, also illustrated by, I want to read their full names. Harmony Becker is the artist and illustrator. Thank you, Harmony. It's also Stephen Scott and Justin Eisinger also worked in collaboration in this book. It's beautiful. It is, again, a banned book. I don't necessarily remember what areas, but it is a banned book. So please read it, especially if you're in Illinois. There's no longer book bans here. I mean, not here. I'm not from here. I don't know. Please read it. It's such an amazing book. Beautiful art, beautiful story. So much that we can learn from reading this book. I love it. Another part of like my conscious content creation that I'm going into in 2024 is also trying to offset as much distractions that I am providing by uploading content that is not centered around issues in the world right now. So to kind of offset like my carbon footprint, if you will, right now in Gaza, they need eSIMs. Right now, the country of is not real, is not allowing aid to go into Gaza and the West Bank. And unfortunately, a lot of the monetary donations that people are making, although very good spirited, very kind, are not getting through. So what they really need right now is eSIMs. So I will be making a donation of some eSIMs to, again, offset any negative impacts that this video is having by clogging up the algorithm with non-Palestinian content. So that is what I will be doing. Again, please read this book. It's very relevant to topics for today, and it's just an amazing book. We love George Takei. He's great. I think you should read this book. I give it like a 10 out of 10. Like, I bought this book because it was a banned book, and I was like, this seems like something that will educate me so much. And it has, and it's led to so many conversations that I've had in my own personal circles. It's led to a lot of, like, I've watched so many videos and learned so much just by reading this book, just by picking it up. Any good book should force you to have a conversation about characters, stories, structure, or the message. So I'm gonna leave it here for right now. I have like over 50 books to read. So this will be a very exciting year for me personally. I've already read another book on my TBR list. So the next book that I'll be covering is A Magic Steeped in Poison by Judy I. Lin. I've already finished it and I already want to talk about it, but my throat is trashed, I'm tired, and I need to take a shower. So be sure to read these things on the shelf. They're not just meant to look pretty. And, check out your local libraries, check out books. You don't need to have the physical book. Audiobooks are also great. They're included in Spotify. You can get a lot of free ones that are in the public domain. There's so many resources. We don't have to be buying books. It's tough out here. We're doing things differently. It's 2024. Consumerism is out. This is in right now. We're reading our TBR list. Okay. Thank you. That's it.